Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Thanksgiving is coming upon us. That's right, we all get to sit around and eat all of our favorite foods, things that are good for us, things that may not be so good. It doesn't matter as long as we get our fill. But what if we could approach this particular holiday with an eye toward what is known as functional nutrition? Well, I guess we didn't think about that before. I thought it was just about going in and overindulging and then taking that long nap as we catch a ball game. But there are more healthy options that we can have for the holiday meals, such as reducing sugar consumption, maybe lightening up on the snacking, reducing how much alcohol we take in, as well as fatty foods. On the program today, we're going to be joined with someone who graduated from the Institute of Integrative Nutrition, and we're going to approach the holidays with exactly that, a way that we could be a lot healthy. She spent 12 years as a speaker and owner of Cindy's Pals Board Review, which provided a 3-day comprehensive dental hygiene review to students, complete with a 400-page book that she wrote to prepare for their 8-hour written exam. We're going to be talking about dental hygiene, great food, and we'll be talking with Cindy Haas here on the Beyond 50 radio program. Cindy, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me to come back.
You bet. So, people don't think about things like this on Thanksgiving. They just think about that giant immovable feast and how they can participate and create as much damage individually as they can, don't they?
Well, that's just the way we approach it.
Yeah, so much for the Pilgrims and the Native Americans. It's the Glutton Bowl, complete with a bowl game or two, right?
Yes, it is, and it's our traditions, and sometimes we don't realize that we can start new traditions. Mm-hmm. It's just making changes, and sometimes it's easier for us to make subtle changes than it is to make great big changes. So I always like to encourage people to move from good to better to best as they make their choices, and certainly as we do the shopping and the preparation for this wonderful feast, we just have to put an eye towards looking at what it is we're putting on the table and how can we make it better. And the way we make it better is by trying to reduce the sugar content, trying to reduce the processed foods in the meal. If you can make it yourself from scratch, that's going to be much better than opening bags and boxes of things. Most of the processed foods come with a lot of extra chemical preservatives that are really not very healthy for us. Just having organic foods in the meal is going to be much better than not. Mm-hmm. You just can't say enough about organic food and real food. We can do things like adding parsnips to the mashed potatoes. We can still have the mashed potatoes, but if you can cut up some parsnips and cook them with the potatoes, you can make those potatoes healthier, and most people don't even notice that they're eating parsnips with those potatoes. Mm-hmm. And then you can take it a step farther by whipping them with coconut milk. And the coconut milk, you don't need to use it for all the liquid as you're mashing your potatoes, but reserve some of the cooking water. And if you're using the sea salt to season your water, that's going to be healthy for you. It's healthier than the iodized salt that's not sea salt. You get more vitamins and minerals out of the salt when you use the sea salt, so that's a really good choice. But then if you use some of that cooking water as part of the liquid as you're mashing the potatoes, then those nutritional factors that are water-soluble don't get thrown away. Mm-hmm. So they go back into the food, and then you can also use that reserved cooking liquid from boiling the potatoes and the parsnips as part of the water or all of the water in making the gravy. Mm-hmm. So these are just some things that people just used to do instinctively because that's the way people cook.
Yeah, I was going to ask, when you take a look at how much food is being processed, with our giant agribusiness, as it's called, how much would you say during the Thanksgiving holidays sugar consumption has actually increased since the time of traditions old, so to speak?
Well, that's a very good question. Years ago, it was very minimal. I honestly don't recall exactly what it was, but I do know that nowadays the average sugar consumption per year is 100 pounds a person per year.
Mm-hmm.
Well, somebody's eating 200 because I don't. Somebody's got mine.
Or 4 other people are eating 50 more pounds than I am.
Right. That equates to about 30 teaspoons a day that comes to us through our diet. And we know that as we start getting into the holiday season, sugar just becomes a very active part of that whole season. We think of the sugar as being the sweets that we enjoy. And what we don't realize is that there are so many hidden sugars in the foods that are processed, and they're put in there, I think, very strategically because the sugar is just so highly addictive. And it's very addictive for a couple reasons. One is just because it lights up the same centers in the brain that cocaine does. We just don't think of it as being such an addictive food, but it really does. It really messes with our blood sugar and gets this blood sugar thing going where we spike up and then it drops down, and that causes us to reach for another something sweet to eat, and we don't even realize that you've eaten the last cookie until you put your hand in the bag or in the cookie jar and it's empty, and you go, oh, I knew that. You don't even realize that you went looking for that sweet.
Right.
But you get that roller coaster going with your blood sugar going up and down. It's very, very difficult to kick out of it. One of the things that I would like to point out is that as people think of the wintertime as being cold and flu season, I would like you to think about it as being the sugar season, because the cold and flu season seems to start right about Halloween time.
You know, it's interesting, too, Cindy, when you talk about it being the sugar season, is that this is also the time of year that's attributed to a lot of depression. And then they try to point, well, it's because we've got cloudier, longer days, and you know, and all these other holidays. You know, there could have been, you know, family members lost, loved ones lost, so they don't get to celebrate the holidays the way they used to. And I think that's a part of it. But I would think, you know, because, you know, as you bring up how much sugar comes into the diet and how it tends to stimulate the same area of the brain as cocaine does. Anybody who has ever used cocaine realizes you get this high, but as you're coming down, boy, you get severely depressed. And if sugar is doing the same thing as cocaine, it would make sense that maybe a good amount of the depression that happens during the holiday seasons is perhaps a result of just over-consuming sugar.
I would say that's very, very likely. It's very likely, and when we go back to just the cold and flu season, it starts around Halloween time, and it carries through Thanksgiving, Christmas, Valentine's Day, Easter, all holidays known for sugar, and then it starts to taper off through the summertime. Okay, and just like you say, the holidays can often be associated with depression because there's a lot of media hype that is associated with the holidays being these wonderful, magical times. And yet, if you're alone or you've lost somebody and you're grieving, you definitely feel depressed, and it seems to hit us hardest during the holidays. So there's really something to be said about that, and there's a reason that they refer to comfort foods as comfort foods, and they kind of soothe us a little bit and make us feel more at ease, and yet it's very short-lived because it is just like a drug reaction of taking cocaine or any other stimulant that's going to be addictive. Whatever goes up is going to come down, and you're going to crash, and that just adds to the depression. And that's what causes people to get hooked on them, is because they don't like that depression, but they really like the high because that feels good. So it is a vicious cycle. It is a vicious cycle, and one of the things that I think we can do with the holidays is to try to take some of the focus off of the food and put some of the focus back on the fellowship and being aware of people. If you have friends in the neighborhood that you know are going through situations like that, encourage them to come over and be part of your celebration, because one more person at the table certainly isn't going to be that drastic of a change.
Yeah, unless, again, we're trying to achieve the blue ribbon for the Gluttony Bowl. I keep remembering, it's funny when I think of Thanksgiving, there's this one Thanksgiving for me that stands out, and it was at a time where I was dating this woman, and we went to the coast to celebrate Thanksgiving with her mom and her stepfather. And he was really an interesting character because I think it's kind of how Thanksgiving changed for me a little bit as far as diving in and making sure you get a hold of everything, you know. And that is, okay, so we're going to move through this course. And this is kind of, you know, my replay of this. But, okay, so let's go ahead and have this first course. Now we're going to get into the turkey and all that stuff that goes around it. And push that aside. Okay, now it's time for the dessert. He kept eating this stuff like he had to move through all of these courses to make Thanksgiving seem like a fulfilled event. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, you know, I remember as a kid I used to like to just eat everything on the table. I mean, that's just how you were, like, oh, that was the time of year you just went nuts. But over the years, when you start looking at this being all laid out, you realize, why don't I just sample little tastes of everything and just eat until I just feel comfortable, you know? But more importantly, slow down and just enjoy being around the people and the feel of the holiday itself. As I did that, I began to realize I enjoyed the holiday much better. And when I experienced this, this seemed to be one of those Thanksgivings that stood out like you just had to get to this part and then to this part and then to this part. It's like, that isn't really how it works, but I guess if you want to connect the dots that way, that's up to you.
That's very true. That's very true. And there's a lot of things that you can do to slow down and enjoy the food, and you will feel much better if you do. One of the things is that...
I'm taking it that you've had that experience with other people.
Oh, yes, I've had them myself. I've had them myself. I know totally what you're talking about, and I can remember even in my childhood absolutely loving the fact that the large family got together and everybody saved their favorite new recipe to kind of debut it on the holidays, and it was just like you died and gone to heaven because we got all these goodies that we didn't normally get. And a lot of it was the sugar high again, but it's also the fact that we spent the whole day eating.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just go home absolutely miserable.
Right.
You know, just stuffed to the gills.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that we can do to alleviate some of that is to take the focus off the food and more onto the people and the social aspect of being with people, even if it's not the loved ones that are departed that you're missing. Focus on the people that are here and just be in the moment and be thankful and have that appreciation and gratitude for what you do have rather than focusing on what you don't have. That's a real key factor. Another factor is how you eat. If you slow down and really chew your food like it's supposed to be chewed, don't swallow it until it's in a baby food consistency. It's going to take you longer to eat. You're going to savor the flavors of the food and enjoy it more. You're going to break it down better because you're not swallowing chunks of food. You're breaking it down the way it's supposed to be broken down so that it goes through the digestive system better. And if it takes you a half hour to get through this meal, you have enough time for your brain to get the message that you've had enough to eat and you'll get full. Mm-hmm. Most of the time, if we just wolf it down, we don't realize there's not enough lag time for the brain to get the message that the stomach is full.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when we overeat, because by the time we get the message, we've doubled our consumption of food. So if we take this more slowly and more gradual, chewing our food to a baby food consistency and really focusing on savoring the flavors of the food, mm-hmm. it really brings more meaning to the quality of the food that you're eating. And one of the things that I find particularly helpful is don't pick up your fork and load it until you swallow.
Right.
Because if you've got that fork ready to go with the next mouthful, it's going in, and you'll swallow just to make room for the next mouthful. It's just like a reflex that we don't even realize that we're doing. So there's definitely something to be said for setting the silverware down while you do your chewing and then load up the next fork and just really enjoy what it is you're eating. And then you don't get so stuffed that you can't enjoy that pie. Mm-hmm. And, of course, we all want the pie.
Sure we do. I find it amusing, too, that when you come around the holidays at how newscasters tend to point and blame the turkey for why we feel tired after the meal. And it seems to me that we've been talking about everything but that, and that what we're talking about makes more sense as to why we feel tired after the meal than that. What is it, tryptophan in turkey or something like that?
Yes, and the tryptophan definitely plays a part in it, but the other part is that we've usually overeaten, and also the fact that the meal is usually way high in carbs, and the carbohydrates, excessive carbohydrates are what cause us to be really sleepy. Anytime you finish a meal and you feel like you need a cup of coffee to push away from the table, or you feel like you just need to lay your head down and go to sleep, your meal has been too high in carbohydrates. And if you can balance your meal with fats and proteins and carbohydrates, you find that you need a lot less food to feel satisfied. You can't overeat on fat because you'll get sick. And there's that shut-off mechanism that says, I'm done. But when it comes to, and usually the proteins have a certain fat content associated with them, but it's those carbohydrates we can overeat on and overindulge, and there's no shut-off mechanism, especially if it's the processed foods, because, number one, they're full of the preservatives and additives that not only are addictive, they're also appetite stimulants. So they encourage us, just by their presence in these foods, to overeat. And when we overeat on these carbohydrates, it does make us sleepy. It makes us very sleepy, and the first thing that happens is that we get a spike in our blood sugar. Once the blood sugar spikes, it's going to drop, and when it drops, that's when we get very sleepy. So our tendency is to have another sugar hit just to kind of wake us up a little bit. Frequently, we'll reach for caffeine. There's just not always an appropriate time to lay down and take a nap, but that's what your body is directing you to do.
Well, it takes a lot of energy, too, for the body to, digest a lot of foods, so that's probably why you feel tired. It's pulling the energy from everywhere else so they can take care of business there in the stomach. But then the other thing, too, is that I hear you talking about is good food combining, and combining a carbohydrate and a protein together, in my understanding, isn't really a good combination.
Well, there's a couple different philosophies of that, and when they get into the discussion about combining foods, one philosophy is that they all digest at different levels. So they suggest that if you eat melons, you don't eat them with anything else. If you eat fruits, you eat the fruits in the morning. And then you don't want to be mixing the proteins and the carbs because you break them down at different time frames. So if you get the system plugged with something that takes a long time to break down, like your proteins or the fats, then it's kind of hard for these fast-digesting foods to move past them. So the food balancing and the way you eat your food has an effect, and most people really have a hard time with that because they're not used to having their meals be all of one type of food. So, and especially during the holidays, that doesn't lend itself so well. However, there's another whole philosophy that says if you get your food balanced with fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, and your carbohydrates not being more than 30% of the meal, or 40%, it's a 40-30-30 concept. As you digest the carbohydrates, they'll go into your system. Then the proteins will come in behind that, and then that'll be followed by the fats, and you can eat less and feel satisfied. And it's also a matter of, if you can do that when you're doing your snacking, make sure that there's some protein and some fat that's available with not just the chips and the dip. It seems to cause you to be a little more satisfied, and it's a more balanced type of meal. So it's not quite the same as just eating the chips. So there's so many different philosophies of how to eat and how not to eat that it's really hard to choose which one is the best. The best you can do is learn to listen to your body. And if it feels good and you don't have an ill side effect afterwards and it's everything in moderation, then that might be okay for you, but what's okay for you might not be comfortable for the next person.
Mm-hmm. I think when you listen to the information that's out there, is they tend to present it in what can be, I guess, considered a blanket effect. Well, this is good for everybody. So one of those, and I know we're going to hear a lot of these on a lot of these talk shows and morning shows, is, how we can have a low-fat perspective about Thanksgiving. Really? And then they come up with all this stuff, and it's like, well, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts are that people don't want to eat food that doesn't taste good.
Right.
And if you strip all the fat out of it, what it did was gave us license to eat more because it was low fat, and we didn't stop to look at the fact that to make it taste good, they had to either increase the salt or increase the sugar.
Ah. So just sprinkle cocaine on your turkey and you'll be just fine, but at least the fat won't be there, right?
Right, and it is important to have fat. It's just important to have the right kind of fats,
right.
And that's why it's important to choose the very best foods to put on the table that you possibly can. If the animals have been raised more naturally, the fat that is associated with them isn't going to be as detrimental to you as the animals that aren't raised in that good, clean, natural environment. Mm-hmm. Makes a huge difference. And in years past, there were high-fat diets were the diets of indigenous people. And they were pretty healthy people, too.
Mm-hmm. Not a whole lot of disease, either.
No, there wasn't. Even the oral disease, which mm-hmm. was kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm. Now, what I'd like to do, Cindy, is to get back to what you would call the nutritious alternatives to the common things we see, let's say, on the Thanksgiving table. Now, you had mentioned coconut milk, and what I had done most recently over the last couple of years is started bringing in almond milk, although now I'm starting to have some reservations on that because of the idea of the genetically modified stuff that's going on. That's one of those elements that may be a GMO, and I don't totally know. But anyway, bringing almond milk in, I found it was a little lighter as far as the texture of it. I used to drink vitamin D milk when I would have milk, but I've pretty much eliminated dairy out of my diet outside of, cheeses or cream sauces that I may make. But I also noticed, too, that when I started changing the recipe by instead of using dairy milk, using almond milk, or as you were mentioning, even coconut milk, that not only was the recipe successful, but some ways you can actually sense that it was lighter as you enjoyed it. And that's part of what I'd like to bring up. But the notorious dish for me, and the one that still leaves me scratching my head why it still gets presented at the table, is the candied yam dish. Now, the yam itself is sweet enough. I just throw a little butter sometimes at best, and that's all I need. But the idea of soaking these things in this deep dish full of brown sugar and maple and all this, and I'm thinking, who thought of something like this? No wonder you're about to pass out after the meal's finished.
Oh, and you forgot the marshmallows.
And the marshmallows, yeah. That just, even as a child, I couldn't even stand this dish. It was just overly sweet. But anyway.
Yeah, it isn't necessary if your family has to have the candied yam. One of the things
and a lot of times they come out of a can anyway.
Yes, that's right. Really
Nobody bakes the yam anymore. Anyway.
Well, one of the things that you can do to make that a better dish is, if it needs to be sweetened, in your opinion, and to meet that tradition, if you can use something like honey or real maple syrup, and they're going to be sweeter, but don't put as much on. Just try to bring down the amount of sweetness that's there. You can do things like baking your yams or your sweet potatoes and topping them with something like chopped up pecans. You can put pineapple with them. Cook them with pineapple and let pineapple juice kind of marinate the yams. that's another way that you can do it that's much more healthier and not quite as much sugar. Just be careful about the type of coconut, or the pineapple that you get. How sugared is it?
And if you have to have the marshmallow look, why not a banana, right?
Why not a banana, right?
Thanksgiving should be experimental. Now, when you think about the combination of all these things that you're eating, and I know your expertise is in oral health, tell us about what happens to the mouth when we consume all of this stuff.
Well, the biggest problem is the sugar.
Right.
The sugar, because one of the things that has been found is that when we eat, we have to break our foods down. So that's where the chewing comes in, and why it's so important for us to chew our foods completely while we're eating, rather than just bolting it down, so that it does get completely broken down, and then it gets taken into the body once it's broken down to its smallest component, and it comes back up even through the teeth. So every cell in the body needs to be nourished and fed, and that happens through our food. So the blood carries it around, takes it to the tooth, in through the tip of the root, up into the pulp of the tooth, and then nourishes the vital part of the tooth. And then there's a flow of fluid that comes out through the teeth, through the dental tubules, and just kind of flushes the tooth out from the inside out. And that's the natural flow of things. And what they found is that every time you introduce sugar to the body, that flow gets reversed, and instead of it washing the tooth from the inside out with a natural fluid and flow of the fluid, it goes just the opposite and starts sucking into the tooth the bacteria and debris from the mouth. Mm-hmm. And it happened even if they used feeding tubes and completely bypassed the mouth with the sugar, so that the sugar went right into the stomach and got into the system through that portal. So the sugar is very, very detrimental to your oral health for many reasons, but it's also a very inflammatory food. So the more sugar we eat, the more prone we are to increasing our internal pH. It's the sugars, it's the animal products, and the processed foods that are going to break down to be acidic, and that causes internal inflammation, and that is what medicine is starting to understand is the precursor to the disease process. Mm-hmm. The more inflammation you have, the closer you are to having a disease process, and that's the philosophy that dental hygienists have worked under as long as I've been in the field. Mm-hmm. So it's adding all these carbohydrates and sugars, it affects your internal pH. So it's very important to try and have something that's going to neutralize that, and the foods that neutralize that sugar and the acidity, that the way it breaks down in our body to be acidic, are the foods that are real foods. So the real foods are the fruits and vegetables. So if we're going to be having all these carbohydrates and the turkey for dinner, it's really important to make sure that you've got some good leafy green vegetables on the table. So a really nice spinach salad, excuse me, anything that can give you that raw food that's a green food, and the vegetables. You can have green beans. They don't necessarily have to be swimming in mushroom soup. Or if they do, make sure it's a good organic mushroom soup. Mm. So there's a lot of things that we can do, making sure that you've got some raw fruits and vegetables as a relish tray and have it available to snack on before you sit down to eat. Mm-hmm. That's much better than having a lot of chips and crackers and cheese and so forth. Mm-hmm. It's just trying to get things balanced a little bit.
Couldn't agree with you more. Nothing like a colorful display on the Thanksgiving table instead of all of it being brown, hot, and plenty of it, right?
That's exactly right.
Cindy, is there a website people can find out more?
Yes, there is. My website is Universal Health Northwest, and that's Northwest is abbreviated NW. It's Universal Health, all one word, NW.com. And I do have some recipes posted on my website that would help people come up with some healthier alternatives. I have a whipped topping that can be made with coconut milk to replace whipped cream or Cool Whip. have some other recipes. Many of the recipes are included in my book, and that's also a site that they can use to order the book.
Very good. Cindy, thank you so much for joining us here on the program. I know my table is going to have a colorful array of enjoyment, that's for sure.
Oh, good for you.
Thanks again. On that website again?
It's Universal Health NW.
Very good. Cindy, thank you so much for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you.
And on behalf of Beyond 50 and all of our staff, we want to wish all of you a wonderful, merry, and healthy Thanksgiving. Enjoy yourselves, and be sure not to overindulge, especially when it comes to those sugars and carbohydrates. Try to have a healthy one so you don't pass out during a ball game. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.